up there, horror fans? Today we're going to be taking a look back at yet another Stephen King book. This time it's 4 Past Midnight, which is a collection of 4 novellas from, I think, 1989 if memory serves correctly, all of which in one way or another deal with the theme of time. It's New Year's Eve as this video is posted, and New Year's Eve always gets me thinking about the passage of time. It's going to be 2025 here pretty soon. I am looking forward to the year ahead with a mixture of dread and anticipation, and I figured it would be worth reviewing 4 Past Midnight for the occasion, because the new year rings in at midnight. I'm honestly surprised none of these novellas mention New Year's in any way. It is the holiday that deals the most with time and the passage of time and perception of time, but hey, what you gonna do? Anyway, yeah, all these novellas deal in one way or another with the concept of time, which is an interesting theme to center around, so I'm going to do my best to review them here, give you a little breakdown of each. Keep in mind, I'm gonna be spoiling the shit out of these, so go pick this up if you can. What you might notice about my copy is that both of the covers have been torn off. I didn't get it this way. It used to have both covers, but now only the spine is intact. This is because, for whatever reason, I don't know if it's just this copy or like all copies, but the spine is way too thin to have all these pages in it. It's like it's overstuffed to capacity, and the spine is all curvy. And so then both the covers dropped off due to tension. So this copy's a real mess, but hey, I'm not going to be reselling this or anything. It's still a perfectly functional book. It's okay. Look how much ridge there is to that. This book's just like totally destroyed. Whoever had it before me clearly did not take it in very good condition or give that much of a shit about it. And now, with my owning it, it's lost both its covers, so that's great. But regardless, this is 4 novellas throughout this page thickness here, the longest of which being the Langoliers, and then I think the shortest one is Secret Window, Secret Garden, and the other 2 fall in somewhere in the middle of those. A novella isn't really a medium I'm too familiar with. Typically, I read novels or short stories. I'm not really into anything that falls into that middle ground. But strangely enough, if memory serves correctly, the Langoliers breaks 80,000 words, which is where I draw the line for, like, definitely novel. I don't even consider stuff that's 60,000 or 70,000 words a novella. I would generally consider something at like 40,000, 50,000 a novella. But I guess Stephen King's standards for what constitutes a novella is different from mine, and he considers stories that are 80, 90,000 words even probably a novella. So these are 4 novellas, according to Stephen King. You're probably asking yourself why I'm reviewing another Stephen King book. I understand that Stephen King is not too popular among certain crowds. A lot of people don't seem to like his books. And what I would say to that is, he's not H.P. Lovecraft, who's a way more problematic, ass-backwards, troglodyte, dumbass figure. And I have no idea why people still read H.P. Lovecraft or give that shithead the time of day even, because he was, like, massively dumb. Not just for his time, but, like, for everyone. Like, his stories have very few redeeming qualities, and they're pretentious and overwritten, and he spells every word like he's fucking British, even though he was an American. And all of his drama or struggles with mental illness or whatever is way exaggerated. Yeah, he's just a massive troglodyte. So if you're going to criticize Stephen King for having some light misogynist themes in his work or doing cocaine in the 70s, I don't get what this double standard is where we don't just, like, topple over the whole shelf of H.P. Lovecraft, because that shit's ass, and it's nowhere near the level of quality that Stephen King brings to the table in terms of narrative cohesion, character building, world building, any of that shit. Stephen King can run circles around H.P. Lovecraft, and as far as I'm concerned, he he's the greatest living horror author. Well, not all of his stuff is great, and definitely none of his stuff is that thought-provoking or challenging. Like, you're not going to get something that totally blows you away or anything. It's very mass-market populist. It's designed to be a fun little popcorn read that's not too challenging or incisive or heavy on the prose. You're not going to get a fevered, tortured masterpiece with Stephen King. But I like Stephen King nonetheless, mainly just due to his work ethic. He's an absolute beast. He just chugs out words like he's a fucking automaton, and I think that's really cool. And it's very admirable to see someone who started out in the 70s and is still going strong today. And for every lame attempt he makes, there's something good. For every Dark Tower, which I don't like so much, there's It. For every Mr. Mercedes, which I don't like so much, there's a Christine. You know, if you don't like one thing of his, you will like at least one thing of his, because he writes with such a diverse range of genres and output and all sorts of stuff that there's at least one Stephen King book you can read that you'll have some fun with. I wouldn't necessarily say that 4 Past Midnight is a good entry point into the Stephen King bibliography, but it was a lot of fun for me to read. And every time I read something new of Stephen King's, while it is very familiar to me at this point because I've read so much Stephen King material, I've read Skeleton Crew, I've read It, I've read Christine, I've read Tommyknockers, I would say that this is a decent output and well worth a read if you're already a Stephen King fan. So I'm just going to get into all 4 of the novellas in here. Let's go! Alright, so first up, we got The Langoliers. Now, I was looking forward to this one because this is the one I've heard about and the one that has the most positive critical acclaim from this collection, obviously. And I believe it was made into a movie. I've looked up some frames from the movie and it looks underwhelming. It looks like one of those Stephen King adaptations that doesn't really have the benefit of a great director behind it. So Stephen King has total creative control, and he doesn't tend to recognize that what sounds and feels really great on the page doesn't necessarily look as cool when it's translated into like direct visuals on screen, especially with 1990s level CGI. So I'm definitely going to give the Langoliers TV movie a hard pass. Maybe if they did it today, they could do it a little bit more justice and give it a little more gravitas, but I think it's one of those adaptations like Thinner that ultimately is just kind of underwhelming and doesn't give you nearly the punch of the book. So I recommend the Langoliers novella. You can watch the TV version after, but it's not going to carry nearly the same level of impact. In the introductory note that Stephen King leaves at the beginning of this one, because he does offer a little insight into each novella, which I appreciate. He says that he did a lot of research with pilots who were like actually versed in the equipment and controls on airplanes to make sure that everything was accurate, which I think is a very refreshing move on his part, because all too often the Stephen King character archetype tends to be a writer. You know, that's Jack Torrance, that's the guy in the Tommyknockers. It's kind of repetitive, and it gets kind of boring after a while to have every single character be like a writer, you know, the same profession as Stephen King. So I will give him props for kind of branching out into another industry. The main character here, Brian Engel, if I recall, Brian Engel is the main pilot guy, and he comes across as knowing what he's talking about. You know, it's about fuel tanks and lift and all that airplane type technical shit that Stephen King obviously wouldn't have known about. So I do give Stephen King props for doing as much research as possible to make this story as plausible as possible. Because the really cool thing about the Langoliers and Stephen King stories like it is that Stephen King is able to make the completely ridiculous and absurd sound completely plausible. I don't think he gets nearly enough credit for that, but he really is good at making these crazy bonkers concepts that are very sci-fi and horror just sound totally reasonable and rational, and the people in the story have to confront this out of left field wild concept, like a clown looking up at them from the sewer or whatever, and treat it with weight and responsibility. And I always like when Stephen King is able to make a crazy idea sound believable. So The Langoliers does deliver in that department. One other thing that Stephen King mentions in the introduction is he compares it to The Mist, which is the story that opens up Skeleton Crew, which I've read. And I will say that Stephen King's short stories are kind of underrated. I especially like The Ballad of the Flexible Bullet, if memory serves correctly. But I would say that The Langoliers is similar to The Mist. If you've read The Mist, you'll like The Langoliers. I actually like The Langoliers more than The Mist because The Langoliers has a happy ending. I like those. And it also feels like a more complete story that more accurately explains the concept of its world and the way that things work, which I just like more in my fiction. Of course, that's a matter of taste. Maybe you're more into the unknown when it comes to horror, but I think that's kind of an idea that was started up by that lame-o Lovecraft. And I like horror that adequately explains the concept and nature of the terror so that we fully get what it is we're supposed to be scared of and we're along for the ride, instead of just vaguely describing some weird blob of shit. And I guess that's kind of the main difference between The Langoliers and The Mist, is that in The Mist it's never really clear what the fuck is going on or what any of the characters are doing. And I remember feeling kind of underwhelmed by that story. I do love bottle stories. I love stories that confine a set amount of characters into a tiny, small, cramped little area and give them room to interact with each other in the environment and all that. I do like that type of story, but I think The Mist is kind of underwhelming because ultimately it's never really explained what even happened or what anything is. So by the end, you're just kind of like, what was the point of all this? Whereas The Langoliers is a nice, complete, fun mystery adventure yarn with a nice little bow on the package to wrap everything up. And it's not entirely pessimistic. Stephen King often likes to say that his stories are very cozy and warm. Again, that's why he's the most popular horror author, because his stories do have a tendency to be really sappy and cornball. And The Langoliers is definitely one of those that's just like needlessly happy, just a fun, rollicking, good time all around. And there's not too much doom and gloom in this one. And I personally find that endearing and fun. So I would say I actually do prefer The Langoliers to The Mist. The other obvious similarity being that The Mist opens up Skeleton Crew and The Langoliers opens up this, even though I guess both of them are the best of both collections. I feel like Stephen King should probably put The Mist like 3/4 of the way through Skeleton Crew, make The Langoliers like the third of 4 Past Midnight, because it is the best one, and ideally you want people to read through most of your book to get to the good shit, instead of just putting all the good shit at the beginning. I guess the principle is that if it's right at the beginning, then people will buy the book specifically for it, maybe read the other 3, but maybe not, and just buy it for The Langoliers, which if you buy 4 Past Midnight just for The Langoliers and stop reading after that, it really is like that good. It's a fun fucking time. So The Langoliers is an airplane type story in the tradition of Nightmare at 30,000 Feet with William Shatner, or the other airplane themed Twilight Zone episode, The Odyssey of Flight 33. I think it's called The Odyssey of Flight 33. I could be wrong on that, but I forget the number. And in fact, The Langoliers makes a direct reference to that episode of Twilight Zone. Stephen King loves doing that. He loves referencing other fiction within his fiction, just to make his fiction feel more believable, that the characters within the fiction are aware of this other fiction. And in fact, Twilight Zone did the exact same thing. In Will the Real Martian Please Stand Up, one of the characters says that the scenario they're in is comparable to a Ray Bradbury story, even though, of course, Ray Bradbury wrote a script for Twilight Zone. So that's a very metatextual commentary within Twilight Zone itself. And now Stephen King is building onto that mythos by directly referencing a similar Twilight Zone episode in his own take on the crazy airplane ride type subgenre. I would say The Odyssey of Flight 33 is actually a pretty ass episode of Twilight Zone. It's not very good. I've never liked it because the whole idea of the episode is just that they go back to dinosaur times and then they go back to the present, and it's not quite the present. They're in like the 30s instead of the 60s, and it's just kind of like there's not too much of a hook to the episode. There's not really a great twist. It's kind of boring. None of the characters are that interesting, and the premise doesn't really end up going anywhere. I do like the stop-motion dinosaur, I'll give it that, but it's never explained really how they can breathe the air from dinosaur times or anything like that. The world building is total shit. I wouldn't go so far as to say that's one of the worst episodes of Twilight Zone, but it's really not one that does anything for me. So I was scared when Stephen King compares his story to that the Langoliers wouldn't be so interesting, but the Langoliers is in fact a much more interesting airplane type story that really goes into some fascinating points on time travel and the way that time works and the persistence of memory and all this interesting shit, and it's a fascinating concept. It's very much a blend of sci-fi and horror because the concept is pretty scientific, and I'm interested that Stephen King calls what the characters in this do time travel, even though it's not really the sort of time travel that anyone else has ever written a story about or thought about, which is what happens to the day after the day's over and everyone's just gone, and it's just like this day that is just devoid of a spark or life, and it's just like this dead, non-existent time that you're not supposed to be in. All the characters are like, we're time travelers, and it's like, well, that's not what most people mean when they mean time travel, but okay. Stephen King also makes a point of it to say that because of this, like, people can't go back in time and change important events, because when you go back in time, like, the past is dead and there's nobody there, even though clearly what these characters are in isn't like the past as we typically understand it. I don't really agree with time travel stories that say that the past can't be changed, because that just doesn't make any sense. I like Stephen King's JFK novel for that exact reason, because in that he says that, like, events can be changed. Here he says events can't be changed. So I guess they take place in entirely separate universes, which doesn't make any sense, because Stephen King's stories are all supposed to take place in one big connected multiverse. But I guess the Langoliers and the 63 novel are set in like totally different concepts of what time travel is or can do. One thing I will give the Langoliers is that the way that the world works in it is really airtight. It's very well explained, and I was never really confused about how energy works or why matchsticks won't light or why the food tastes like shit. It all makes sense and it's very believable, except for that some luggage, and at one point the villain is able to get hold of a gun, and it's like, why is there all this luggage and gun left in like the personal lockers at the airport, but other stuff isn't there, like people's plates and stuff? Like, what exactly are the rules as to what's left and what's disappeared in this timeless state? So there was that. There was also a point where the pilot guy says that the Langoliers sound like a particular thing, and then he never brings up again what that thing is that they sound like. I guess Stephen King just forgot that he had set up that mystery and then just never revisited it. That's okay. And then the only other plot hole I can remember is that at the very end, they crash into the airport, like the airplane literally collides head-on with the airport, and then once they're transported back into normal time, once the day is born, so to speak, they just kind of walk around like everything is normal, and nobody in the airport seems to comment on the airplane crash outside, which, you know, you'd think would be kind of a high security event. And the survivors of the Langolier incident just go off to, I guess, have lunch or have fun or something. But you'd think like the pilot would have to at least answer for freaking airplane he crashed into the airport, because presumably that's still there. Like, he crashed into it during the timeless state, but once they're back in the flow of time, like, it's still there. So I felt like that was kind of a plot hole. Oh yeah, the other thing is, when they're trying to re-enter their own time, they forget, for whatever reason, that they have to be sleeping when they go through the thing, and the mystery writer gets up and is like, we've got to all be sleeping, but the British guy holds him down for no reason. Like, this is an obvious objection, and for a second I thought the story had completely forgotten its own logic. Like, if they're sleeping when they go one way, of course they have to be sleeping when they go back. But Stephen King just kind of forgot about this to introduce artificial tension, which I felt was a little stupid, because you'd think after the ordeal that these people have been through, they wouldn't just, like, hold one of their own down just because he was raising a very obvious concern, and you'd think maybe they'd want to listen to him just, like, right away if there was any doubt or hesitancy on anyone's mind. And I find it just kind of artificial that nobody else considered that they have to be sleeping when they go back through the time rip or whatever it is. That was a little bit of contrived conflict to me. Your mileage may vary, but for a sec I thought that the story had just totally forgot its own internal logic. But luckily it hadn't. I mean, I'd much rather there be this forced last-minute conflict than like the entire story just fall apart due to like messy writing and forgetting how the world works. And I also think that it is necessary to sacrifice the British guy at the end. That's a neat little bit of personal drama, that he's so conflicted and he has to atone for all the shit he's done in his life, and he can't be with Laurel. So that's a nice little, self-sacrifice. I think the story gets some added weight because of that, and that's nice. Although, come to think of it, it's also a plot hole that they couldn't just put it on autopilot and set an alarm or something to wake up once they're through. I don't know. I do feel like there would have been some kind of way where one of them wouldn't have to die and sacrifice himself just to get through. Then again, I'm not a pilot, so I don't know how these things work. One other compliment I would like to give the Langoliers is that Stephen King does a great job of making sure that all of the characters are very well developed, and they all feel like very unique people with very different worldviews, which again, for a bottle type story, you kind of need to create that interpersonal conflict and various dynamics that people have with each other when they're confined to a given space, a given area of time. And so that's nice. The British guy, who's like supposed to be an MI6 agent or whatever, he says matey all the time, which I don't feel like British people say. I feel like mate is an Australian saying. I don't feel like British people say it that often, but he's like, oh, matey. I don't think Stephen King understands a British dialect very well, but honestly, I'd rather an American butcher and culturally appropriate British culture than the British do that to us, which seems to be the whole trend nowadays. I guess I'll let that slide. The British guy is an okay character. My favorite character, probably the mystery writer, I would say, out of the bunch. He's very interesting. And again, Stephen King is kind of putting himself out of his element here by writing from the perspective of a mystery writer as opposed to a sci-fi or horror author. So the deductive logic that the mystery writer applies is very consistent, and he's a fun character, and he's very likable. So I'll say that. I would say the weakest part of the Langoliers is actually the villain, Craig Toomey. Now, he's a really fun villain, but he's a stock character that you see pop up with Stephen King stories again and again and again. In Jack Torrance, in The Bully from It, this type character is always present. Just some kind of manic psychopath with some kind of traumatic backstory who's dedicated to just messing everyone's day up for no discernible reason and listening to all the crazy shit in their head. And I'm sure a lot of people have their own take on Stephen King's treatment of mental illness and how it works. And that's a thing with every horror author. You're not going to get an accurate depiction of mental illness from a horror story. That's just not really how it's going to work. So I think everyone can kind of toss that behind them in terms of what you're going to get from a spooky story. You're not going to get like a really psychologically sound photo of someone's psyche or anything like that. But I'd say the main problem with the insane characters that Stephen King creates is like all of them have this overly detailed backstory that's like, this is exactly why this guy's crazy. Here's exactly where this trauma stems from. Here's exactly where this issue stems from. And I just feel like insanity isn't always like that. Like, some people just go crazy for no discernible reason. In Craig Toomey's case, his whole deal is, like, his parents were abusive and his dad was like a workaholic, which ties in nicely with the Langoliers. But then his mom, there's this whole bit where, like, his mom, like, lights a match between his toes and shit. And it's just like, not every crazy person has a backstory this elaborate. Some people are just sick in the head. Some people don't have causes for their mental illness. And I think that's actually more interesting and scary. What if someone was just completely messed up in the brain, even though they had, like, loving parents, a fine childhood? That's a topic that Stephen King never even seems to consider, because he is remarkably, like, forward-thinking, I guess, in terms of just assigning every single neurosis and mental issue that someone has to a concrete event that can be named and defined and explained. And it does kind of lessen the impact of insanity when every single evil/crazy character you have in your story is, like, given a detailed backstory as to how they are the way they are. Not necessarily that Craig Toomey isn't fun or anything. He's a very fun antagonist, and it's very cool how he provides just this unshakable obstacle for all these people who are just trying to get the fuck home and get away from the Langoliers, and he's just a total wrench in their side. But I do feel like that's worth pointing out, that the Stephen King stock villain is, like, so repetitive and samey. Again, the bully from it is, like, pretty much the exact same. Or Jack Torrance. You see this type character once, seen him forever. Oh yeah, and they're also all redeemable too. Even Jack Torrance, like, they're all very sympathetic. And Craig Toomey's like, oh, I have issues. My issues come from so-and-so event in my childhood. It's so sad. And I just feel like Stephen King can't just write a fucking depraved maniac, and that'd be a neat writing exercise to assign to him, because he just can't seem to do that. The best part of this story are the Langoliers themselves. I fucking love these monsters. These are awesome. I love the idea of some red balls just crisscrossing the landscape, eating reality into nothing. It's such a fun image, and it really sticks with me. It's a very original concept, and it's a lot of fun to just imagine these deranged Pac-Men just swarming the land and taking big chomps out of everything in front of them. And again, I really like how believable Stephen King is able to make these things. They're just a force of nature, like the sun or moon, and they don't care what's in front of them. They're not evil. They're just an active force of time. They're just time marching forward. It's really beautiful in a deranged way that these big sentient red balls are just yumming up the entire world all the time, and none of us ever see it. It's actually kind of cute. I think the Langoliers definitely deserve a spot in the monster canon alongside Pennywise in terms of great Stephen King monsters, because they are vividly realized, and I love that Craig Toomey has a name for them that he thinks of before they end up in this altered state, and then they get there and he's like, they're the Langoliers, and that's what they're called, and they are real. They really do exist. He's told scary stories of them when he's young, and then he realizes, oh shit, they're real, and they are actually going to kill all of us. And that's just amazing. That is such a fun idea. I love that Stephen King is able to take these crazy bastards and make them real. It's beautiful. That's the power of fiction as far as I'm concerned, and they are the most powerful aspect of the story. Hands down. They are so fun, and when they finally make their appearance after the whole story, you feel like you've read to a great point, and it's just going to get really fun from there. Another thing worth mentioning about the Langoliers is that it has an audiobook read by Willem Dafoe. I find it wild how relevant Willem Dafoe has managed to stay all these decades later, but if you want to get the Langoliers audiobook, it is advertised here on 6 audio cassettes at the back of 4 Past Midnight. I imagine if I sent this in today, I probably wouldn't get the audiobook, but it's probably better than the TV movie anyway, and I'd like to hear this story in Willem Dafoe's voice. That would be kind of cool now that I think about it. There is a point in the story where Denver is given a prominent role in the tale, where they see that all the lights in Denver are off, which is a very haunting image to me, and I like that Stephen King mentions Denver in his stories, even if not all of them are set there. The Shining set in Colorado, obviously, and Joe Hill's novel, Nosferatu, is set in part in like the Boulder foothills along the highway between Boulder and Lyons, which I've been to many, many times. So I like seeing places that I've been to and interact with on a daily basis mentioned in fiction. Stephen King also says that his characters aren't going to go to fucking Boston Airport, they're going to Bangor Airport. And he's like, yo, my characters are going to Maine, bitch. And the characters do that. I kind of have to give him respect, even though it's not really plausible why the pilot would insist upon going to Bangor instead of Boston. I have to give King kudos for just putting his state in everything and saying, screw it, I'm not going to put it in the more popular location. This is where I live. I write about where I live. I write about my state. I love Maine. Maine, no one else cares about Maine. Nobody even probably knows that Stephen King is from Maine, but he just puts it in all of his stories, and I like that. You know, I admire that. I think that's cool. It's nice. He really does give a shit about his own state, so I can't fault him for that, even if it's not really believable, and the airport where they land is pretty generic. There's not really anything about Bangor Airport that's, like, very specific to the plot. So it could really be at any airport. He's just like, I'm setting this in Maine, because that's what I know. I write about what I know. And, you know, credit there. Stephen King loves his state. I would say The Langoliers is a really fun read. And again, if you pick up 4 Past Midnight just for The Langoliers, it's a lot of fun. The characters are all great. Even the female characters, I know some people say that Stephen King can't write convincing female characters, but for the most part, Laurel Stephenson, if I remember her name correctly, and the teenage one, and the blind girl are all very well realized. All the characters are well realized, except the sleeping guy, and I kept thinking that the sleeping guy was going to be useful to the plot in some way, come in at the last minute. Come to think of it, and this shouldn't have been the end of the story at all, but it would have made more sense. They should just told the sleeping guy to fly the plane through the time rip, and that way none of them would have had to sacrifice themselves, because you basically forget that he even fucking exists, and he's not present in the story at all. Even at the end, he just like doesn't give a shit, I guess. It's weird to include a character like that literally just does nothing. Yeah, they could have just told him to fly it through the time rip for all anyone cares about. It would have been funny. It would have been messed up because he wouldn't have known what he was signing up for, but it would have been very funny. It's weird that guy even exists. I'm not exactly sure what Stephen King was going for there. I guess he's just tossing that in there for funsies. The other interesting thing worth mentioning about the Langoliers is that a lot of people, I guess these days, view it as an early example of liminal spaces. I wouldn't necessarily go with that, because I don't think Stephen King necessarily had any of that in mind. I don't even think the Backrooms crowd, as annoying as they are, particularly latches on to the Langoliers as a story, but I do find it interesting that he mostly identifies it as a time travel story. Because what they do really isn't time travel. Again, not in the way that normal people understand it. It's a very original concept, certainly for the time. If this is the first example of liminal spaces in fiction, that's just an example of Stephen King cooking here. Last thing I feel is worth mentioning is that The Langoliers is probably the last fun science fiction airplane story before 9/11. And these days, any story set on an airplane is just like, yuck, I'm done with this crap environment that's not fun or interesting, and it's just a total invasion of privacy. And I don't fly airplanes, so it's not fun. I mean, this is the last story where riding on an airplane bound for some nightmare realm sounds fun, because these days airplanes aren't bound for nightmare realms anymore. They aren't really like the domain of interesting concepts or space-time voyages or any shit like that. They're just like dull and stifling. At least from everything I've seen. I'm never traveling anywhere via airplane. It seems like the worst possible way to travel, because it's just neurotic and paranoid. But this is the last really fun airplane story pre-9/11, and Stephen King made it, and it's fun. It is absolutely in the vein of Nightmare at 30,000 Feet or any other sci-fi airplane horror tale. It is leagues above Odyssey of Flight 33 again, so if you're into some airplane type fiction that's spooky and scary, this has got your goose cooked. This is what the doctor ordered, and you should read The Langoliers. I highly recommend The Langoliers. I will give it a 5 out of 5 big ones, because it is fun. My gosh, this story is fun, and it's one of my favorite Stephen King stories. It's better than The Mist. Really, really fun little novella that adds a whole new dimension to Stephen King's universe, and some really fun and inventive monsters that have their own unique motive. The Langoliers hate laziness. If you're lazy, if you drag along, if you don't get the fuck out of there, they're just gonna numb you up. And I just really like that. They're such fun creations. Yeah, Langoliers, 5 stars. Fantastic story. So, next up on our dossier, 4 past midnight, we're talking about Secret Window, Secret Garden, the second novella in the collection. This one was turned into a movie starring Johnny Depp that apparently nobody remembers, and most people probably don't even know is a Stephen King adaptation. I haven't seen it, but if I had to guess, it's probably not that good, so I'm going to skip that and just talk about the story here. So the premise of this one is pretty simple. There's a writer. This character's a writer because Stephen King loves having character inserts who are of the same occupation as him, which some people don't like. Again, that's one of the reasons I like The Langoliers, because he's kind of going outside his comfort zone. But hey, there aren't that many writer protagonists in fiction. So the main character's a writer. He's in this fancy summer cabin on the shores of some Maine lake. And then this southern bumpkin comes up knocking at the door and is like, "You have my story, bitch. You better give me my story, 'cause I wrote this story and then you ripped it off, yo." And so the whole premise of this novella is that this writer has to figure out how this bumpkin happened to have written the same story as him, or whether he plagiarized him or who plagiarized who, while at the same time he's going through this messy divorce and his wife has a new husband and all of this. So it's a very multifaceted story and a character study on this character Mort. I do like that this story incorporates some kind of Edgar Allan Poe-esque elements. A lot of people just say that Stephen King takes influence from Lovecraft. Gosh, I should hope no modern writer takes influence from that racist troglodyte. But I do like that Stephen King incorporates a little bit of macabre poetry, so to speak, in here, with the idea of burying your wife outside in the garden. It reminds me of one of the best episodes of Alfred Hitchcock Presents, or The Black Cat, The Premature Burial, all of that. It's an interesting premise, and I like how gruesome it is. And I also like the idea of reality imitating fiction, and how the line between fiction and reality is blurred for this writer character, which, being creative myself, that often happens, and I like the idea of that. So that's a good, fun time. However, there are some issues to this story that I do take grievance with, and which knock the story down a couple points to where it definitely isn't on the same tier as the Langoliers in terms of having an exciting original premise. First thing, which I find somewhat annoying, is that the entire story is told from the perspective of Mort, and at the end it turns out that Mort is crazy. Yes, Mort is stark raving insane, and it just happens that he's pissed at his wife for divorcing him, and he hates her new husband, and so he goes off the rails and invents this new character, John Shooter, who's not even real. He's just a figment of Mort's imagination the whole time, and he's just guilty about some plagiarism he committed back in his college days. And so the whole story is about his descent into insanity as this John Shooter guy keeps harassing him, but really he's just harassing himself, and his mind is just slipping. He just hates his wife. And then at the end he tries to kill his wife, and she's saved by the insurance agent that helped her out earlier, which seems very contrived. It seems like he got there just in the nick of time. But yeah, so that's this story in a nutshell. Just guy goes crazy, makes a bunch of stuff up. The problem with that, of course, is that from the opening page, I was actually really hooked with this one, and I thought, wow, this is an interesting premise. This writer is presented with this guy who says that he plagiarized him, but he thinks that the guy plagiarized him. So, like, who's plagiarizing who, and how the hell did this happen? Because the circumstances are extraordinary. You have the exact same story, just worded slightly differently, and they're bickering over who made it first and how someone could see it, and all this. And that's a really thrilling and interesting premise, but Stephen King kind of wastes it by at the end just revealing that Mort and John are the same guy, and nobody plagiarized anybody, and this incredible mystery that's been set up. Because ultimately, I feel like this should have just been a straightforward mystery story, considering that the main character is, again, a mystery writer, and that genre was also explored in the Langoliers. I feel that the twist where Mort is just crazy kind of cheapens the premise, when there could have been a whole host of fascinating explanations as to how John Shooter managed to write the story first. Like, what if John Shooter's a time traveler, that could be the case. But again, Stephen King already set up in the Langoliers that time travelers can't really affect the course of history, except, like I said, in 1163 or whatever the JFK novel is, the time traveler does affect the course of history. So, not sure if the Langoliers and the time travel novel that I forget the date of are set in the same universe, but then again, all Stephen King material is supposedly set in the same universe, so I guess he just has kind of wishy-washy rules on time travel. Regardless, I feel like time travel would have been a great explanation for how John Shooter was able to write the story, and Mort Rainey is confused about it. And it would have had both characters be real people, because John Shooter is legitimately a threatening presence. He's a neat character, and if he was just a crazy bastard who, through some inexplicable circumstances, has found himself at Mort Rainey's throat, that's where the suspense comes from. But when you realize it's just the same guy and he's just making himself crazy, it kind of cheapens all the tension that's been built up to that point, where you feel like this guy is legitimately in danger of being murdered, and he's being threatened by this obscene psychopath. I feel that in some ways the character was just crazy the whole time. Cop out is kind of like the character was just having a dream the whole time. Cop out. Like, how invested am I supposed to get in a story where the person whose perspective we're following is literally so unreliable that their mind can just make up any event? This was very poorly foreshadowed throughout the story, like the bit where Mort and John are out on the road and the old guy sees them, and then he says, "Oh, there was just you out there, Mort." And I kept thinking, there's no way Stephen King is just going to have it so that John is a figment of Mort's imagination. He's not that lazy. I mean that's just a terrible way to go about things. But then no, that's exactly how it turns out. Yeah, it's just very cheap because you feel the whole time like, oh, Stephen King's gonna come up with some killer twist, like that's really fucking awesome. But no, the guy's just crazy, and he just makes up this character in his head who like slams his face into a car door and shit for no reason. I don't really get it, but hey, that's insanity for you. Like I said in the Langoliers segment, Stephen King does have a more modern and nuanced approach to mental illness and insanity than your average horror author who just writes a crazy character as like just crazy. Stephen King obviously has a lot of experience with mental illness, given the copious amounts of coke he did back in the 70s, although I do think he's certainly mellowed out and sane now. But I do think that in this case, especially, the explanation that the main character is just crazy and everything he does has some kind of traceable lineage, right down to that he plagiarized someone in college, is just really cheap. And again, Stephen King can't write a crazy character who's just crazy. Like, suppose there was just this crazy southern bastard, John Shooter. He comes off like incredible, like some Texas Chainsaw villain or something. But then it's just revealed he's the imagination of this writer. And it's like, you can't just make a crazy character who's like thrilling and fun. And this is, again, the problem between The Shining book and The Shining movie. In The Shining book, Jack Torrance is given this big excessive backstory about how he fell into alcoholism, why he bumps Danny's head, so on and so forth. Tons of exposition as to how he goes crazy. And in the Kubrick version, he's just fucking crazy, and you just like that. You like to see Jack Nicholson just be fucking crazy. You don't need to know how he becomes crazy, because that kind of cheapens the fun. And it's nice to just have a character who's batshit bonkers wacko. I think Stephen King is incapable of doing that, and it was much better done in The Dark Half. It's not as well done here. This feels kind of like off-brand Dark Half, if that makes any kind of sense. But yeah, because the main character of The Dark Half's a writer too. For those of you who haven't seen The Dark Half movie, it's actually really good. It's one of the best Stephen King adaptations out there. And it's one he was behind, so I do recommend The Dark Half movie, actually. The premise of this one kind of reminded me of The Outsider, which is one of my favorite Stephen King books, definitely one of my favorites of the 2010s. I read it immediately once it came out, and I thought, wow, Stephen King really still has the chops to pull a fantastic horror novel out, where the premise is that this guy is convicted of a horrible crime, but it turns out that he has a completely convincing alibi for being somewhere else at the exact time the crime was committed. So it turns out that the crime that he's accused of having committed was done by a shapeshifter, this monstrous entity. And I thought that was a really clever way of explaining how the guy could be in two places at the same time with this disgusting shape-shifting creature. But here, there's none of that. The guy is just crazy. And I feel like that's a really cheap way to get out of an interesting premise, is just to say that your character was crazy the whole time. Truth be told, Stephen King does try to add in a supernatural element at the last second by explaining that apparently John Shooter was so vividly imagined by Mort that he took on a life of his own, and he left this note for the wife inside his hat. His hat's mentioned throughout the story, but it's shoehorned in this little epilogue that feels very tacked on, that like John Shooter became real or something. Okay, let's see John Shooter become real in the same way that Stark from The Dark Half does. Let's see him manifest into something real instead of just being a pale figment imitation of what was achieved with the Dark Half. Let's have a story about John Shooter instead of a story about some crazy guy imagining John Shooter. It's just like too much reliance on this guy being crazy, which again, if this was just a bare bones mystery story with no supernatural element, I wouldn't mind that. But even then, having your character just be crazy is cheap, and then to add a supernatural element at the end on top of that really just feels like Stephen King is trying way too hard to make this story have some kind of impact that it just does not have. Because once you realize that the entire story, you've just been following around this crazy goof-ass who burns his own house to the ground and tries and kills his wife and gets up to all sorts of fucking hijinks, kills his own cat, and even, like, again, causes himself bodily harm because he's convinced that he's someone else. I'm just like, well, this ran out of steam quick. John Shooter doesn't even seem threatening like Stark from the Dark Half because he's not really a separate entity. He's just like a fictional character cobbled together from bits and pieces and anecdotes. This was done so much better in the Dark Half again. If there is one thing I can give Secret Window, Secret Garden credit for, it's Stephen King seeming to try and grapple with his masculinity and accept that men are capable of some truly depraved things if their minds start slipping, or they go through a rough divorce, or they don't get to live in their house anymore, or however. In the first bit of the story, you feel relatively bad for Mort. It seems like he's going through a rough patch, but as the story devolves and you see how crazy he goes, and you realize how much contempt he has for his wife's new husband, it gets pretty interesting as far as the gender dynamic. And as a guy myself who has to think about relationships a lot, even though I'm not in one, this story kind of hit uncomfortably close to home for me. So I will give Stephen King credit in that he's trying to grapple with the effects of toxic masculinity, the patriarchy, all of that type of thing. Which, good on him. He's a very cognizant writer when it comes to that sort of thing. And he's written some very strong female characters over the years. A lot of people, again, accuse Stephen King of being misogynist, and I really don't see it. The only thing that annoys me about Stephen King's writing is how he shoehorns in a reference to penises in every single book or story, and it's something that you just can't not notice once you first initially notice it. Every single Stephen King novel, novella, even most of the short stories have a reference to a penis in there somewhere. It'll just be going along, and then it'll come to a dead stop because he's got to reference someone's penis doing something or feeling some sort of way. And it's like, I don't care about this because this is just irrelevant to the story. I don't care about how this character's penis is feeling. And he never does the same for any vaginas, it's all just penises. Once you notice this about Stephen King's writing, seriously, it will get on your nerves as much as it gets on mine. That's what gets on my nerves about Stephen King's writing. I don't necessarily think that Stephen King is a misogynist. In fact, he seems to be relatively ahead of his time, especially if we're talking 80s and 90s, in terms of feminism and well-written, well-rounded female characters and all that. I don't really think he's ever had particularly a problem with that. And anytime there is a sexual element to his stories, it always seems relatively earned, it always makes a decent amount of sense, and it seems narratively justified. The only thing that's not narratively justified are the constant penis references. He can't seem to stop thinking about it for whatever reason. Like, a lot of people criticize the ending of It, and really the ending of It makes complete narrative sense when you consider that the Losers Club all have this sort of weird bond towards each other during the Chinese restaurant scene, and if that ending wasn't in there, the story itself wouldn't make any sense. I really don't mind the ending of It that much. Which again doesn't make any sense because I'm asexual and I know that I should be bothered by explicit sexual scenes like that. But I just think, well, I've gone through 1,000 pages of content and this doesn't bother me so much. But what does bother me are the penis references, which have no reason whatsoever to be in there, and I have no idea what Stephen King is on about with that. It's probably a long-lasting side effect of cocaine use or something. I will say this, though. Mort Rainey's wife in Secret Window, Secret Garden is very much that stock sort of character. That's not to say it's just girls that he can't write. Like I say, he does the same with the stock kind of character like the bully from It, or Mort Rainey, or Craig Toomey, or Jack Torrance, or the lunatic type character. And it's no exception here. His wife is very flat, one-dimensional, not much is said about her, and the relationship dynamic is not very fleshed out as far as that goes. It's not all that interesting. One thing that does interest me is that the ending where his wife comes in and finds Shooter written all over in the walls and stuff reminds me of a lot of the scene in The Shining where Wendy finds Jack's manuscript and it says all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. And I'm not sure if that was in the book or not, but it seems like Stephen King and Stanley Kubrick really do have a lot in common as far as their minds go with these tropes and events and things that happen in the story. That really sounded like the ending of The Shining to me. So maybe Stephen King is subconsciously pulling from The Shining movie without recognizing it, because it really is similar. And the bit where John Shooter, who's actually just Mort Rainey but with the dumb hat on, chases her. It's just like in The Shining with Jack Nicholson chasing Wendy up the stairs, and Wendy has the bat and swings it at him. It reminded me a ton of that. So I'm not sure if Stephen King is ripping off Stanley Kubrick or if this is just unrelated or whether it was in the book or not. But suffice to say, I do think that they have more in common maybe than they're willing to admit as far as just like the events and plot contrivances and things that go on in the stories. I mean, it does seem very similar. But then again, like I say, tons of Stephen King characters are just character inserts who are writers and going a little crazy, a little eccentric, or have like some kind of problem or something, or just work themselves to death. You know, Misery's the same. Misery is about a writer. So many Stephen King books about writers, like he just keeps going on that tack, which, as a writer myself, I have to say it's nice to see some representation in popular fiction. It just seems like it kind of speaks to a lack of willingness to expand one's perspective. But I will say this, I don't particularly mind it. So anyway, yeah, Secret Window, Secret Garden is pretty boring, except maybe the end where it seems like she might actually get killed. That part is actually pretty scary, very tense, very, very suspense-filled, but other than that, it's pretty bland. And once you realize that it's just about a crazy guy who's making all this shit up, I tended to lose interest, which I was able to guess it about 50 pages or so before the end, or maybe before that, I forget. But I will say that I guess for fans of Edgar Allan Poe, maybe this is a nice little homage. There's not much to do with a secret window or a secret garden in here. That's just referring to something in the writer's house that he burns down. Which, again, I get that he's trying to kill his wife or kill her new husband or whatever, but why would he burn down his fucking house with all his manuscripts and shit inside? Does he hate himself as a writer? I guess maybe that's the implication, since he is a plagiarist and he feels bad for being a plagiarist when he plagiarized back in college. It's all just explained through these really ham-fisted dream sequences, which again are another Stephen King trope. I feel, though, that this would be way cooler if it was really about a secret window or secret garden or something. You know, like Rear Window, with like he sees his wife cheating on him through the window or something. That's what I thought of when I heard the title, but no, it's just a story about a crazy guy that ends up trying to kill his wife, gets killed at the end, again, spoiler warning, by the insurance agent, and then his wife's like, ooh, John Shooter was actually real. So I would give this one like 7 out of 10. No, 6.5 out of 10. I wouldn't feel comfortable giving it a 7 out of 10. It's not that good. But for what it's worth, I got through it, and you can get through it too. It's well written, it's just that the plot really goes nowhere, and there's no interesting twist, and the premise is totally wasted again by having the main guy just be crazy, which really cheapens the outcome. Yeah, one final thing I will say about this story is, while Stephen King does seem to be grappling with the effects of toxic masculinity, with the damage that being obsessed with an ex can do to the psyche, and how you can go to some very dark places by dwelling in that sort of behavior, I will say that he does tend to excuse Mort Rainey way too much, in the same way that, like, he excuses Jack Torrance, who's a fucking alcoholic child abuser. That's why The Shining movie is great, because obviously whereas Stephen King saw Jack Torrance as this sympathetic character, because he's basically him, Stanley Kubrick was like, nah, Jack Torrance is a piece of shit. And that really comes across in the movie, that Jack Torrance, while insane, and the ghosts of the Overlook are making him crazy, he still does bear some responsibility for being such a massive, insane piece of shit. And I feel like Stephen King uses the excuse that John Shooter has technically manifested himself physically to kind of give Mort Rainey a free pass. At the end, Mort's wife is like, oh, he was still in there somewhere, and he didn't really want me to get killed, so that's why he brought the insurance agent in to kill him, because he really didn't want me dead, because he's such a great guy. He's so good at the end of the day, even though he tried to kill me and went full crazy. He's such a great guy, which I feel is just kind of a cheap excuse, and really lessens the impact of, again, a scary story about this guy who goes full-on psycho, obsessing over his ex. I just feel like Stephen King does not really understand how a woman in that scenario would feel, and he gives her too much leeway to just excuse her husband. Is like, oh, he was a great guy, except how he tried to kill me, and I know deep down he didn't really want to, but John Shooter, the homicidal southerner psychopath, made him do it. And John Shooter's like, I don't know about that, Mississippi ma'am. I'm just a down-home country boy. God damn it. His dialect is really fun. I wish John Shooter was just a real character, because he is intimidating for the first bit of the story. But yeah, Stephen King tries to come to terms with violence and domestic abuse. It's not handled in the best way, I'll admit. But I still think it's a bit extreme to call Stephen King the greatest misogynist writer out there or anything. I've read way worse. Robert Heinlein, for instance, don't get me started on that shit. I would say Secret Window, Secret Garden is a solid 6.5 out of 10, but definitely nowhere near an 8 or 9 out of 10. It is not a satisfying mystery story. In fact, The Langoliers, which borders way more on sci-fi, is actually a more satisfying mystery story, which adheres to the conventions of the genre, considering that one of the characters, again, is a mystery writer and approaches life through that lens. Fascinating little story nonetheless. Let's turn the page and get on to the second really impactful narrative in this collection. So, let's talk about The Library Policeman, the third novella. I read this one while I was riding the bus down to New Mexico, and when I got to the beginning scene where Sam Peebles enters the Junction City Library, I was passing through Walsenburg, which is a small town very similar to Junction City, or how I imagine Junction City is. So it really set the tone, and as a result, I'll definitely remember this story probably the most of any of them, but that's just a sensory connection, the same way that popcorn reminds you of the movies or whatever. I'll remember this story because I was reading it while I was passing through a very similar location to Junction City, which is yet another of Stephen King's fictional locations, although this one isn't in Maine. It's in Iowa, so a bit of a change of pace. Sam Peebles also isn't a writer, which is a nice, refreshing twist. He's just an average businessman, which makes it kind of more relatable, I guess, to the everyman, which is what this story is going for. And as Stephen King points out in the introductory note to the novella, he provides a little bit of context to all of them, which I like as someone who's written an introduction to my work myself. I think it takes a certain level of skill to write a competent introduction and give a little context to how the story was created. Stephen King says that he initially wrote this story to be kind of funny, but as it went on, it got more and more depraved and unhinged, and then by the end, it's so scary that it's like one of the scariest things he's ever written. So I was ready for a fucking whammy. I mean, if the Langoliers isn't one of the scariest things he's ever written, if the Library Policeman outdoes it, holy shit, how bad can the Library Policeman get? How spooky can this story really be for such a wacky premise? And the answer is, it's not really a scary story, it's just an extremely depraved and fucked up type of story. So it's less scary in a visceral, cerebral way, like Suspiria, and it's more just kind of gross, like in a Serbian film type way. It's not really, like, scary. I don't know what Stephen King was going for with that. But I don't even think the Library Policeman generally succeeds in the same way a lot of shock films do, like Cannibal Holocaust or whatever, because it is a book and you can't really see what happens, so it just comes off as kind of try-hard. That's the best way I can describe it, and to those of you who haven't read The Library Policeman, I am going to be spoiling this one, and the story kind of flips once the twist comes around and you kind of question what you've been reading this entire time. So, fair warning, this is a very controversial entry in the Stephen King bibliography. When I looked it up, some people said it's like fantastic and the twist completely redeems it, and until the twist they couldn't take it seriously, but the twist made it so that it was like one of the best stories ever written. And other fans say that it's complete garbage and the characters are like paper thin and the plot makes no sense. I would say I fall somewhere in the middle, just because I definitely think Stephen King has written worse stuff. I've read worse stuff that Stephen King has written, and I've read a ton of Stephen King stuff, but also I really don't think The Library Policeman is a masterpiece. I will say it left more of an impact on me than Secret Window, Secret Garden, but it is not as good as The Langoliers, and not even close to that, and definitely not one of Stephen King's best works. So, The Library Policeman follows Junction City businessman Sam Peebles as he checks out a book from a spooky library run by this spooky, creepy librarian, Ardelia Lortz, who's like all the stereotypes of the bitchy librarian rolled into one. She's like, be quiet, you gotta return your book on time. And so Sam Peebles thinks, I'll rent these books, and then I'll return them. And he gives a speech for the Rotary Club. And his secretary is Naomi, and she's like a basic love interest, although with a little more depth than the wife from the last story. Not as much as the female characters in the Langoliers, but a decent amount of depth. She's one of the better written female characters in this book. So then you've also got Dirty Dave. Now, Dirty Dave happens to steal Sam Peebles' books off his porch, and then the books get grinded up into pulp. So Sam Peebles is like, oh shit, what am I gonna do? Sam goes down to Dirty Dave, and he goes down to the local homeless shelter where Naomi coincidentally works. And she calls herself something different. I think Sarah, yeah, if memory serves correctly. Then he has to do battle with the Library Policeman, which is this malignant entity that collects the books when they're due, or it kills you. If you can't return the books, then he'll just chop you up or murder you or whatever. So the premise of the Library Policeman is admittedly pretty fun and original, and I can't say I've heard of anything like it. I don't think I've really even heard of an evil librarian in all of horror media before. So it's a fun concept, and you get kind of a twofer here. You get Ardelia Lortz, who's this creepy librarian, plus you get the Library Policeman, who's an even creepier Slender Man Babadook type figure. And the Library Policeman appears on these creepy posters inside the library that are very memorable and vivid, the way that Stephen King describes them. I kind of imagine them being drawn in a 60s type style, late 50s, early 60s, kind of like Charles M. Schultz or like P.D. Eastman or something, with like this very spooky graphics. And I tried looking up Library Policeman poster for some fan art of what this was supposed to look like, but nobody can really capture that type of look, like that late 50s, early 60s style. But that's how I imagine it, because that's when in universe these posters were drawn. And Stephen King does such a good job of making them seem real, like you've seen them in some library at some point in time. This menacing fucking library policeman figure that just towers over the kids who get their books returned late. So it's a very original monster, and the first time the library policeman appears, you actually think it's going to be good, but then he has this stupid fucking speech impediment where he has a lisp, and that was kind of endearing for Bill Denbrough from It, but you didn't give Pennywise a speech impediment, because then you wouldn't be able to take him seriously. So the library policeman sounds like fucking Tigger, and he's like, "Come with me, son, I'm a policeman." He doesn't say thun, he says son. He can pronounce the S in son, but not the S in or the CE in policeman, I guess. And I'm sure Stephen King has done research into how speech impediments work. That just seems a little goofy. So, again, until the twist comes, you don't know why the fuck the library policeman has this stupid speech impediment. It really diminishes your ability to take him seriously as a threat. Like, what if he just didn't say anything or talked like, a fucking gruff FBI agent or something? But he talks with this lisp, and it's like, okay, but why though? And you wonder why that is, and it's explained eventually, but it gets a long time to get there, and in the meantime you just can't take the main thread of the story seriously. Also, you can't take the main thread of the story seriously because Dirty Dave explains basically off the bat that the library policeman isn't real, it's just a projection that Ardelia Lortz is creating. And at that point, how are you even supposed to take a story called The Library Policeman seriously when the main monster is just an illusion created by the actual monster of the story, who's way less interesting because she just puts on the appearance of an old lady in her 70s. There's a lot that I take issue with The Library Policeman with over besides just the twist. That's the most controversial part, but there's a lot to dislike about with this story. For one, there seem to be way too many coincidences, like for instance that Dirty Dave both drew the original posters of the Library Policeman, happens to know all the valuable and useful Library Policeman lore, and also happens to be the exact same drunkard who steals the books and grinds them up, initiating Sam Peebles' conflict. Also, the bit where Naomi Amos tells Sam what happened with Ardelia Lortz, but never gets around to it and just doesn't tell him, and he ends up having no idea, or how basically nobody's willing to tell him what happened with her when, like, it would help him out a great deal. And there's no real reason why the characters have to be so obfuscatory when it comes to just like telling him what the fuck went on with this crazy lady who killed people back in the day. The other thing that's worth pointing out is that Ardelia Lortz isn't really an original monster. I mean, she takes the form of a librarian, but she basically just has the exact same powers as, it, Pennywise, the Deadlights. She's probably a fellow Deadlight. She's probably the same species as Pennywise, just the Midwestern variety, because it gives the exact same description about how she feeds on the fear of children and the vulnerable, and she sucks the fear out like tears, and it's like a yummy substance for her or whatever. And all this just seems like it's a lesser version of It, because I have read It, and It is a lot better at explaining how Pennywise works. But if I had to guess, I'd say Ardelia is probably one of the Deadlights. Although she could also be akin to Rose the Hat from Dr. Sleep. I've only seen the movie of that, but I imagine she's about the same in the book. And it's sort of a vampiric figure who also feeds on fear. And the problem is that these two characters, these three characters, Rose the Hat, Ardelia Lords, Pennywise, it's all kind of the same when you have these monsters that feed on fear. It just gets kind of repetitive after a while. This is yet another Stephen King trope that I find somewhat annoying. I would say that the Langoliers, for instance, are a much more worthwhile addition to the Stephen King mythos, because you feel like, finally, a monster that doesn't feed on fear. It's a monster that exists on time. It likes yumming up time. It doesn't care about whether you're scared or not. It just wants to eat the day, like some kind of demented fucking Greenwich Standard delineation or something. That's an awesome idea, but my point is Ardelia Lords is just kind of the same old that we've already had 100 times with Stephen King, both in the form of vampires and like Deadlights, and it just kind of gets old. I feel like if the story was legitimately just about the Library Policeman, it would be way more compelling. You could have Ardelia in there too, but make them two separate entities and make the Library Policeman's powers and traits distinct from Ardelia's, and have them be two separate things that Sam and Naomi have to go up against, instead of just one. Because combining the two and having it in the back of your mind all the time that the Library Policeman doesn't even exist, and that he's just being projected by Ardelia to give off the illusion that there's such a thing as the Library Police, that's lame. What if there was a secret society of Library Policemen, and they're all like inhuman monsters of some kind? That could be fun, but instead we just get a Pennywise clone. And it's very generic, and we've heard it a million times before in Stephen King's books. I will say the notion of a Library Policeman is one of those boomer things that you just have to get used to with Stephen King's work. He's an old guy. He grew up when the library system was at the peak, so the Library Policeman is probably actually something that he heard of when he was younger and was made to instill fear in him. And so he made it into a story. Admittedly, I've never heard a story about this character before, the Library Police. Here in Denver, they don't even charge fines anymore if you bring your book back late, so there's not even any punishment for bringing your book back late anymore, which I think maybe there should be, because people should bring their book back on time. But I will say that this is a novel and original concept, and I do like the idea of a story potentially about the Library Police, even if this isn't the best example of what could be done with the concept. You could have a lot of fun with it. I also feel like it is a very outdated story. I mean, in Secret Window, Secret Garden, we already had the bit where Mort has to order the copy of the magazine in time. And now we have basically the exact same plot element where Sam has to fly to Des Moines to get the books that he lost and return them to the Library Policeman on time. And it is very outdated in the age where you can buy any book with next day shipping. It's like, this could have been solved so easily. I mean, maybe not the exact copy from the 1930s, and it's explained it has to be the exact same edition and whatever. Well, it just feels like very kitschy and of its time, 1988, 1989. Although the modern library that Stephen King describes, as opposed to Ardelia Lords' creepy time slip type realm, is obviously more indicative of how a library is today, modern. It has computers, it has styrofoam packing and all that. And he does a good job of distinguishing between the two different libraries. So, props there. It's just this is kind of an outdated story, so you have to roll with that and accept it. So now I guess it's time to talk about the twist, which is the part where Stephen King was saying, oh wow, this story got really scary at the end. It got so scary. I thought it was just going to be kind of a lighthearted joke story, but it got scary at the end. which, again, it doesn't get scary, it just gets completely messed up, and you feel like you're reading a completely different story at the end than you were at the beginning. In the beginning, it seems like a lighthearted screwball affair. Sam does all this wacky shit. The jokes for the John bit actually managed to get a chuckle out of me. That shit was fucking hilarious. He vomits on his rug, he drinks so much. But by the end, you feel like Naomi is a completely different character than she was at the beginning, where she's just some wacky secretary. And you feel like Sam is like a totally different guy. Maybe it was just that I was on a trip when I read this, so it was very different where I was when I finished it than when I started it, but holy shit, this story takes you on a fucking roller coaster ride of depravity. And that's maybe its greatest problem, is Stephen King talks like him turning it really jarring in the last bit is like great because it makes it scarier, it makes it more impactful, but really it just leads to tonal inconsistency where you feel like you're reading a totally different book by the end. So, spoiler warning here, the reason that the Library Policeman has a speech impediment is because when he was a kid, Sam Peebles had to deal with a fucking rapist pedophile who was posing as a library policeman outside of the library and said, like, I'm the library police, and if you don't return those books, then you're going to get raped. And then it happens, and it's described in visceral fucking detail. Now, again, those of you who say that Stephen King is just a misogynist and he writes too much about men violating women or whatever, he can absolutely depict male-on-male violence with a convincing degree of realism and intensity. This is one of the most fucking messed up stories I've ever read. I can see why this isn't one of his more popular ones, why most people skip over this, say. I can see why it isn't as popular as, like, The Langoliers, which, by comparison, is just a fun little B-movie. But this is, like, totally fucked up on another level that it doesn't really seem to call for, because it starts out with such lighthearted, low-stakes energy. It's like it's just gonna be a fun little romp with these goofy characters that seem, like, wacky and shit, and then it just, like, devolves into what the fuck type territory where your mileage will vary whether you think that this sort of thing is justified or whether Stephen King can convincingly pull it off or not. But I do think that it works if you have a really strong stomach for this type of thing, which I do. I've seen Cannibal Holocaust, so I can get through stuff like this. This is basically the literary equivalent of something like Cannibal Holocaust because it's so needlessly graphic, and it's like, I thought I was reading a story about a monster that hunts you down if you don't return your library book on time. Library Policeman goes from being this fun monster with a fun gimmick to just being like totally fucked up and messed up in every conceivable way, and I don't think it ever really picks up the fun again after that point, where you realize that Sam Peebles is hiding this horrible trauma. He's suppressed this trauma for so long that it, like, gnaws at him to the point where his life is ruined. That does explain why he gets so drunk at the beginning, why his life seems so, like, ramshackle and kind of messy, but again, it just doesn't feel like the same character at all, and neither does Naomi for that matter. Like, these characters transform so much. He uncovers so much repressed trauma and guilt and horrific details inside himself that it's like, was this really necessary? Also, to go back to the coincidence argument, I feel it's kind of a contrived coincidence that Dirty Dave did paint posters of the Library Policeman, this character, and Sam Peebles just happened to have a run-in when he was young with someone who said they were a library policeman. I feel like there's way too many coincidences in this story to even count, and they're very contrived. But the fact that Sam literally has someone who pretends to be a library policeman. Surely that wasn't a common occurrence. Even back in Stephen King's day, when everyone drank water out of the garden hose, I don't imagine people posing as library policemen to have their own sick way was like that common. So this is just yet another needless coincidence where Sam Peebles has a past with the library policeman to bring the story kind of full circle, where not only is the library policeman an imaginary monster, which admittedly I'd rather the library policeman be a real monster like the Langoliers or Pennywise again, but the library policeman was some real person at some point in time, just like a sick, depraved freak, which Stephen King, I don't know if he's the best at writing the sort of character who realistically is just like a complete sick, depraved freak. You know, like more sick and depraved than even Jack Torrance on a magnitude of 9 million. So that's most people's main complaint with the library policeman, is that it goes bonkers batshit off the rails in a way that you wouldn't expect, in a way which it doesn't really need to. Like, I'm sure there's a way Stephen King could have written this story where it's not so graphic that it would turn off, I imagine, about half the readership at that point, who just don't want to hear about this stuff, even if it is, like, justified within the narrative. I just feel like Stephen King doesn't have the tact to pull something like this off, especially when he's, like, so populist and fun elsewhere. Like in the Langoliers, there's nothing in the Langoliers that remotely suggests that 2 novellas later you're going to get some shit like the fucking library policeman. Maybe my least favorite part of this story is that Sam Peebles in the beginning is set up as kind of a loner who isn't really good with romance or relationships, and it's implied that he and Naomi have some past, but it doesn't really work out, and Naomi doesn't like his advances, and he's reasonably polite about that and backs off and just keeps to himself, keeps filing his paperwork or whatever the fuck. I felt like this was a relatable character, being asexual and aromantic. Here's a character who is just friends with Naomi, because she's also a member of Alcoholics Anonymous, and it feels like Sam is learning about her and her dimensions and might just want to be friends with her and doesn't really want to, you know, start up a romantic thing going, because that would kind of undermine both of their characters, considering that they're both extremely traumatized. You know, Sam from his experience with the library policeman, Naomi from alcoholism. It felt like they were just kind of going to become good friends who trusted each other and could count on each other, but not a romantic thing. At the end, or near the end, Sam experiences a lot of mental turmoil on the flight to and from Des Moines, and he remembers what the library policeman means, and then it says at one point, oh, you don't want to not be in a relationship because then some people might think you were a policeman, meaning, you know, a pedophile, just because you're not in a committed romantic relationship. And I feel like here Stephen King really betrays his outdated ideas and prejudices, and it makes no sense to force this character who has undergone sexual trauma in his past into a romantic relationship. That seems completely cruel and needless. This character, Sam Peebles, who's been through so fucking much in his life, does not need to be in a romantic relationship with Naomi, who also, keep in mind, is deeply scarred and traumatized. You don't need to force these two characters together as like a power couple. I feel like that's so fucking stupid. And to reinforce the stereotype that just because someone is scared of a romantic relationship because they've undergone sexual trauma, that means that they're doomed to repeat a cycle of sexual trauma or some shit like that, is fucking stupid. And people should not have to enter a romantic relationship. At the end of the story, it's like Sam Peebles has completely conquered his trauma. It's literally represented by the spider web of fear on the back of Naomi's neck, and he just tosses it under the wheels of the train, and he's just like, yeah, we're a couple now. We're not scared anymore. Let's kiss each other. And I just feel like Stephen King has clearly never undergone actual sexual trauma, because if he did, he would get that it's not that easy and you don't just get over it, and some people who have been through that will never be in a romantic relationship ever again, and they shouldn't have to be. And society shouldn't force them to be or create a stigma around people who don't want to be in a romantic relationship. That's fucking stupid. And that's honestly way more disgusting than the graphic flashback, is the idea that these two characters have to be in a romantic relationship when they could easily just be friends, and it'd be so much more satisfying and make so much more sense. It's totally absurd. I will say that the idea of the library switching back and forth in time is pretty cool. Time slips in Stephen King stories are always welcome. I always like the way that Stephen King is able to mess with time and create a very nostalgic American atmosphere. Again, the Midwest setting is very neat. It feels very run down, unappreciated. Junction City sounds like a corner of America that nobody really gives a shit about. And I will say that for all the faults of the story in terms of its depictions of sexual trauma and assault and all of that, I do think that his depiction of the alcoholics and the homeless characters is at least relatively nice, and he does seem to have a good degree of sympathy for them, especially Dirty Dave, who by the end is a pretty likable character and a lot of fun. Although I will admit that his recounting of the events is way too long and drawn out, and you don't really need this many details just to explain that Ardelia Lords is some kind of fear-sucking vampire monster, and I really don't feel like he had to go in that detailed about whatever happened, because it's just not as cool as Stephen King probably thought it was, all the lore behind Ardelia Lords. The lore behind Lords. I didn't even mean for it to come out like that. As for the library policeman / Ardelia herself, how would I rate this particular monster in the Stephen King multiverse? Well, she definitely ain't any Pennywise, I'll say that. And I will also say that I feel like, again, Stephen King's approach to mental illness, where every single neurosis that someone has, like Sam Peebles' reluctance to be in a relationship in this case, even though he's not the lunatic type character, where every single hang-up someone has can be traced back to a direct, identifiable point. Like everyone who doesn't want to be in a romantic relationship has been through some horrific sexual trauma or something. And that's not the case. And Stephen King doesn't seem to recognize that some things in the human mind just can't really be explained. They can't just be categorized and put into boxes. But Stephen King takes a very modern, psychoanalytical approach to the whole thing. Like, I don't want to have sex or romance ever, but is there any one particular thing that causes that? No, it's a multitude of factors, and to get to the root of it would be virtually impossible. Stephen King, however, takes all these mental variables and ties them up in a neat little bow, a nice little package, and I really just don't feel like the human mind is that easy to define. And maybe that's the greatest flaw with Stephen King, and it's what separates him from the greats, like the real greats, like Thomas Ligotti. A good horror author who's not just a crowd-pleasing populist like Stephen King. And there's nothing wrong about writing like that. It's fun to have B-movie pulp that's not visceral or intense like Thomas Ligotti, but it's just fun. Like, Stephen King is very fun, but he doesn't seem to recognize the complexity of the human experience, and it can't just be boiled down to a sequence of events that's just like step, 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 step. You actually have to explore, like, how deranged things can become inside the mind. That's why, again, one reason why the movie of The Shining is better than the book, and I'll argue that all day, because it just takes into account so much more of the complexity of the psyche, and it's designed specifically to unnerve you in very specific ways that Stephen King just can't seem to, because he believes that human beings are these simple mathematical equations that can just be cracked open like a puzzle box. and that's just really not the case. So his characters can come across feeling very simplistic, sometimes very reductive, and I don't feel like Sam Peebles or Delia Lords for that matter are any exception to the rule. They are very one-dimensional, one-note, flat-type characters. Same goes for Naomi, same goes for Dirty Dave. These aren't really characters that are designed to last more than one novella. They certainly aren't the level of the characters in it, who I'd argue are the most fleshed out, realistic, deep characters Stephen King has ever written. Sorry if it seems like I compare all of these novellas to it or The Shining at one point or another, but I have to have my benchmarks here. And it helps to understand Stephen King's specific style. I don't mean to berate the guy. He is a fantastic writer and definitely one of the greatest still living horror icons of our time, but it's worth taking into account that not everything he writes is going to be a slam dunk. Anyway, The Library Policeman is a cool idea, and I'd really love to see this character in a more versatile way where he's just a malicious being that gets on your ass if you don't return your library books on time. That could be a fun concept. And like Stephen King says, it could be a funny concept too, because the beginning of this story seems pretty damn jovial. And then it just goes completely off the rails, and you realize, oh, well, the library policeman is real, but I'm not really sure I want him to be, because he was more fun as just kind of a generic Stephen King type monster. This is a bit too fucking real here. I just don't feel like Stephen King is able to give these characters or the monster, the titular antagonist, enough depth in the length of this novella, although I'm not sure it would work if it were expanded out to 150,000 words. And again, the tonal whiplash is so jarring. Either it will work for you or it won't. I would argue this story has a bigger impact than the Langoliers, certainly, but that's only because the Langoliers is like fun and interesting, and this just feels like a slog to get through. And I can see why some people say that the characters are really poorly written and the concept is seriously underdeveloped. It seems like Stephen King was just kind of on crunch time with this one. But it definitely has a lasting impact. This is a story that I will remember for a long, long time. But it feels kind of like it cheated because it just used such graphic, disgusting imagery that you kind of have to remember it, in the same way I'll always remember Cannibal Holocaust. At what cost? I mean, can a story just stand on its own as a truly great story? I'll also always remember the Langoliers, but that's just because it was fun and cool. But this, it's like, wow, Stephen King, you really went there, didn't you? And that's not going to be to everyone's taste. Although, if you argue that Stephen King only ever puts his female protagonists, like Carrie or whatever, in danger or harassment, read this, I guess. It definitely bucks the trend. It certainly is something different that you wouldn't expect going in. And I think Stephen King's heart was in the right place. He was trying to make a serious story about a serious issue, and just kind of use the monster as an allegory for that, as like a stand-in. But I think Stephen King's advantage, really, ultimately, is that his monsters are literal. They're not metaphors for something. Everyone says Pennywise is a metaphor for fear, but the reason Pennywise is so fucking awesome is because he really isn't a metaphor for fear. He just likes eating fear. He's a monster. He's a clown that lives in the fucking sewer. And there isn't any real-life counterpart to him. He really does just torment people for his own sick gain. But he's fucking cool and neat and very memorable and an icon for a reason. I fucking love Pennywise. Pennywise is fun in a cool, monstrous way. But he's not an allegory. It's awesome, and I love the idea of a literal monster way more than a figurative, imaginary one. I feel like the Library Policeman plays into all the weaknesses of King's monsters and none of the strengths, because he might deny it, but one of his strengths is that he can create a really vivid type monster that sticks in your head. The The Langoliers are definitely in there, but the Library Policeman is absolutely fucking not. I would have to give this story a 7.5 out of 10. It's definitely better than Secret Window, Secret Garden, but again, tonal whiplash and way too many coincidences and plot contrivances. And the twist, I would say it works for me, but it might not work for you. It's a very divisive story for a reason. And it's not really required reading for anyone who just wants to get the basics of the King bibliography. I can see why this is one of the more deep cuts. Anyway, let's get this out of our heads and move on to the palate cleanser, the last one. Alright then, we finally made it to the end of this little tome, and if you'd followed along this far, you'd know that we're on 4 past midnight, that being the Sundog. What to say about the Sundog? Gosh, it's an underwhelming conclusion to this collection. It doesn't even really stand up to Secret Window, Secret Garden in terms of impact, and it falls prey to one of my most common criticisms of Stephen King's books. I think I said this in my Insomnia review too, is that when you're making a multiverse and you're trying to interconnect all your stories together, part of the problem is that oftentimes your work can just feel like a commercial for something else as opposed to something that can stand on its own. And just like Insomnia seems like a long drawn-out commercial for the Dark Tower series, the Sundog feels like a commercial for Needful Things. King even blatantly admits as much in the introduction to it, that it's designed to be a standalone novella that works on its own terms, but it's also designed to get people to go out and buy Needful Things, which I guess came out immediately after this in the King bibliography. I have mixed feelings on that. I haven't read Needful Things. Oddly enough, I've read so many Stephen King books, but there are still quite a few I have yet to get to, and Needful Things does not currently interest me. I'm also reading a ton of other books at the moment, so I don't really have time to cram Needful Things into my schedule, mainly because I've never even heard anything about Needful Things, good or bad, so I really have no idea how it goes. But based on this story, and I imagine that Needful Things probably shares some kind of setting or premise with the Sundog, I don't think I would be that much into Needful Things, just given how underwhelming the Sundog is. Like I said, the Sundog doesn't even really manage to be as captivating as Secret Window, Secret Garden. It's got an interesting premise, I suppose, but just like how the Langoliers could be cited as an early example of liminal spaces, the Sundog is very likely the inspiration behind the Smile Dog creepypasta. It's a little too similar for my taste. I'm pretty sure whoever wrote the Smile Dog creepypasta probably read the Sundog. Otherwise, it's an insane coincidence. And as someone who really grew up on the Smile Dog creepypasta, and that's some iconic internet lore to me, the Sundog, even though it did come first, and I should probably give the credit to Stephen King at the end of the day, it just doesn't have the brevity of the Smile Dog creepypasta. And keep in mind, I'm not even big into creepypastas. I think a lot of them are really poorly written, and I do prefer professionally written fiction to Jeff the Killer or whatever, but I think that the Sundog's major fault is that it's way too drawn out for a premise that is extremely simple and basic, and could probably work as a short story the length of, say, Grandma and Skeleton Crew. In the introduction to the Sundog, Stephen King specifically points out that Castle Rock is his favorite main town, his favorite fictional creation, his favorite, most detailed, intricate setting that he's made up. And I just feel like this does a massive disservice to Derry. I feel like Castle Rock is not as well developed a location as Derry. I mean, once you've written a book as good as it, as competent as it, and you've fleshed out the entire town from the barrens to the drugstore, everything in it feels extremely vivid. It's been like 3-4 years since I read it, and I still remember so much of the geography of Derry because it's incredible. I really doubt that Castle Rock can stack up to it, so I don't really understand why Stephen King wants to die on the hill of calling Castle Rock, of all places, his most interesting fictional town, or the one that readers should really remember. I feel that Derry is a more interesting setting. You've got the house on Nebolt Street. You've got the ravine where Pennywise lurks in the darkness. And the real shame is that compared to the quantity of novels set in Castle Rock, Needful Things included, the number of novels that King is set in Derry pales in comparison. There's It, which is easily enough for a fictional town to have. He really develops Derry in that one. There's also, I think, Dreamcatcher, and then you've got Insomnia. Insomnia is set in Derry, but it's so poorly written and boring that the whole time you barely even notice that it is set in Derry, and that's a real shame because it doesn't even feel like the same town, and I'd love to see Derry get some more fleshing out, some more development. It's a fascinating location, and even if it was very extensive, you could add something else cool to Derry's geography and give it even some more layers and depth, especially with the long and storied history of Derry that King goes into in it, with the black spot and all that. Like, that stuff is fantastic. That's wonderful world building, some of the best in all of speculative fiction. So to see King go back on that and just say, no, Castle Rock is the most important city or town in my fictional main geography, it just seems a little duplicitous, and I think he's doing himself a disservice there. And I will say this much: Castle Rock is an okay spot, and it probably stacks up a little better than some of the towns that Stephen King mentions every now and again that receive even less development. And of course, Castle Rock is also the setting of that newish show. I forget what network it's on. So it does have some things that are set there that are prominent and that you've probably seen or at the very least heard of. I just don't think it really stacks up to Derry. The other problem with Castle Rock, of course, that I have as a Coloradan is whenever I read a story set in Castle Rock, I'm thinking about the real Castle Rock south of Denver, which I've been to. So when I'm reading this story set in Stephen King's main Castle Rock, which presumably is also named after a rock that juts out from the ground and looks like a castle, I just can't help but think of the Coloradan Castle Rock. That's extremely confusing. I know that Castle Rock is just the name for a rock that looks like a castle. It's a generic name. There's also Jailhouse and Courthouse Rock in Nebraska. So Castle Rocks just happen to look more like castles, I suppose, but that is very confusing for a Coloradan who lives near a Castle Rock, and it just bothers me that the most famous Castle Rock, the one that most Americans probably even know, the most prominent one, isn't even real. I feel like Stephen King kind of steals the thunder of a Coloradan location by naming his main town after a Coloradan town. Or he probably didn't deliberately name it after the Coloradan town, but he could have come up with a much more original name that was cool, like Derry. I mean, that's a town that no one's going to confuse with any town anywhere, because it's unique. I also feel like Derry just sounds way creepier and less generic. I mean, that's the type of town where Pennywise would hang out. Pennywise isn't hanging out down at fucking Castle Rock. He may as well be hanging out down at White Castle. As someone who's dealt with a lifelong fear of dogs, I feel like this story should, for all intents and purposes, scare me, but it really just doesn't, mainly because, like I said, it takes way too long to reveal what the hell is going on, how the camera works, why the dog shows up in it. It takes like 20 pages just to mention what the hell the camera is taking pictures of, when really it cut more to the point and be more direct and intense if the minute that Kevin DeLevin takes his haunted picture, it just describes how horrible the picture is and how terrifying it is. But because it skips like 20 pages ahead to explain what the hell is going on or why it's even disturbing, the impact isn't really there. And I'm left just kind of feeling like it was forestalled or something. Like it was held up by a bunch of filler. Again, there's really no reason for this to be an entire novella. It should just be a short story. Some premises just don't work in long form, and they don't work if they're stretched out to this obscene length. But Stephen King is very prolific and loves to show off his word count, so that's okay. I do the same. I've been known to at points. I just don't feel like it works here. The other very annoying thing about Stephen King is just the regional stuff. Stephen King points out that Pop Merrill has a predilection to say what I mean to say, and after a certain point, this little idiosyncrasy becomes kind of annoying because it's obvious that Stephen King is attempting to replicate the typical Maine accent, but as someone who's never been to Maine, I can't really hear it in my head. I don't really know how people in New England talk. I barely even know how people in New York talk, let alone northern New England, specifically Maine. And this character, Pop Merrill, who is very annoying in his own right. I really don't like the character all that much. He keeps saying, yeah. He's like, yeah. And I just can't imagine anyone saying that, let alone an American. It seems so old-fashioned and old-timey, like a peppermint sugar drop or something. I get that Stephen King is proud of his state's dialect and how people talk, and he's trying to give the characters some down-home cracker wisdom, but it's just not really for me. I don't find the character all that appealing on that front. Kevin's okay, the main character. Again, this story just seems so tame, like so fucking tepid after the Library Policeman. It's total tonal whiplash. These stories really don't have anything to do with each other besides the consistent theme that they're about time. Two of them, Secret Window and Library Policeman, involve trying to find a book that's out of print, and then this one's about a camera. So I do feel like the theme that ties them all together, that being time, could have been handled more consistently. Like, you could have come up with creative ways to incorporate time into the plot, but also you shouldn't have stories like the Library Policeman and the Sundog back to back, because they're so different that I don't even know how to really talk about the Sundog after you've been through the Library Policeman. Sundog's just about a scary dog that lives in a camera. It's not that disturbing, really, even if Stephen King tries his best to make it come off as such. I do feel like the ending where the Sundog comes out of the camera is not that much of a twist. It's what you expect to happen the whole time, because the dog just gets closer and closer the more pictures, and then at the end it comes out the camera, and it's like, I get it, that's what was going to happen. It's a dog, it lives in the camera, it wants out, okay. But why in particular is this dog such a threat? Like, I get that it's supernatural, it's a ghost dog or whatever, and it lives in the camera, but couldn't you just kill it like you can a normal dog? What about this dog in particular is so terrifying that once it comes out into the real world, you can't just deal with it? I mean, it's not fucking Gozer, it's just a dog. It's just a average-seeming kind of mangy mongrel that lives inside this picture. So why exactly am I supposed to be scared of this dog to the same extent I'd be like scared of Pennywise or the Langoliers? It just doesn't seem as intense as some of the other stuff that Stephen King is able to cook up. Again, as someone with an intense phobia of dogs for most of my life, I should find this story really scary, but when you get right down to it, it is just a dog that lives in a camera. It's not Pennywise. Let me give this story one compliment, I suppose, and that would have to be Stephen King does seem to understand Polaroids and photography very well. And the part where Pop Merrill talks about how pictures used to be, how developing them used to be, and how easy the Polaroid is in comparison to that, to the old-fashioned cameras. That's very neat that Stephen King did his research and really looked into the subject. And I like the idea of a story about a camera. I have, of course, seen better stories about a camera. For one, a most unusual camera from the Twilight Zone. That camera story outdoes this one 10 to 1 because it's actually really fucking interesting. But I would say that Stephen King does have a decent amount of respect for the medium of photography, and it's cool to see a story much like Word Processor of the Gods from Skeleton Crew that talks about this old-fashioned, outdated technology as if it's brand new, which it was at the time, of course. And just like how Word Processor of the Gods reflects Stephen King's fascination with computer word processor programs and how you can suddenly write crazy amounts just like with a typewriter, but you can edit it at your will. This seems like he's talking about Polaroids versus older cameras, which is very funny now when Polaroids are considered vintage by every hipster around and everyone's like, yeah, Polaroids are the best, they're old-fashioned, but here they're like the most kitschy, tacky birthday present possible. God, I can only imagine what it must have been like to walk into a fucking Radio Shack back in the day and just see, like, tape decks for sale. That's insane. Best Buy sure as hell doesn't stock tape decks, and you can't even ask the fuckers to repair your tape deck for you because they're incompetent, and they only know how to repair computers and shit. Suffice to say, this story will be very nostalgic for anyone who owns a Polaroid or has good memories of a Polaroid. It's a very Polaroid-y type story, and it's nice that Stephen King is giddy about the technology and likes making a story specifically about how cameras work. Ultimately, though, much like how there was that terrible movie back in the 2010s called Polaroid that's just about a scary Polaroid that kills you if you take a picture of someone, this really feels like a drawn-out creepypasta, especially since I'm like 99% sure it's probably the inspiration for Smile Dog, and considering that there isn't even a picture of the Sun Dog in here like we have a picture for Smile Dog, I'm not nearly as scared by it, and it's way too drawn out to have any real impact. So I would give the Sun Dog probably around... Actually, I would give it an 8, because it is nicer to read than the Library Policeman. If the Library Policeman has a 7.5, then the Sun Dog has an 8. But it's definitely not a 10 or a 9. Definitely not as creative as the Library Policeman, because that story just goes off the fucking rails. But the Sun Dog is close, I guess it's closer in line with the Langoliers, but it's not as interesting a premise, and it's a very underwhelming end to the collection. So, yeah, 8. That's probably a little high, but I do have to give it higher than the Library Policeman, because there's just a lot I find to be problematic about the Library Policeman. It's a very disturbing story, and the Sun Dog at least isn't, like, overtly offensive or anything. It's a little tacky, but it's not going to actively harm you. So, there you go. A comprehensive review of Stephen King's novella collection, 4 Past Midnight, one of the thickest books in my trove, and both covers have worn off. It's a total wreck. I'm definitely not reselling this hush puppy, but hey, it's a pretty fun read. It's interesting if you're interested in seeing what Stephen King does with shorter fiction that isn't quite a short story. And I will say, if you liked The Mist, if you've read Skeleton Crew and you like The Mist, you will like the Langoliers. I can't say whether or not you'd like the Langoliers more. I like the Langoliers more than The Mist. But the Langoliers is the standout of this collection. Once I finished the Langoliers, I was very skeptical that any of the remaining 3 stories would top the Langoliers in terms of just, wow, this is a slam dunk of a story right here, and I can't get enough of it. But I tried and I made it through the whole thing, and I'm trying to be kind of a Stephen King completionist here and read as much of his stuff as I can, because I do find his career very interesting. And I'm glad he's still with us and still pumping out the good stuff. Gosh knows we could use a competent horror fiction writer in these dark times. Yes, sirree. We need someone to write that horror fiction like there's no tomorrow. He's getting up there in age, though, so I sure hope there's some newer horror authors who are willing to take up the mantle, take up that reign, become the new greatest American horror author, and bring the pulp and the fun and the spectacle of the genre back to mainstream attention, the way it fucking should be. Anyway, this collection ends off with a little excerpt for Needful Things, which almost reminds me of the little excerpts of the next Goosebump book that used to be in the back of Goosebump books, and if there's one horror author I sure as fuck don't respect, it's R.L. fucking Stein. That guy's a greasy hack and he writes crap for toddlers, so I'm definitely not going to read Needful Things, probably. It just seems like a very kitschy ploy. I'll probably go for Salem's Lot next. Maybe some more of the Joe Hill stuff, because I really like Nosferatu. I remember, because that's set in Colorado, and I really like that. I like Christmas Land. So I might read some more of Joe Hill's books. I don't know. I'm currently on some Ray Bradbury, and I'm just on a big, long speculative fiction binge. I'm reading like 5 books simultaneously, but I like keeping my mind active. I think it's very important. I will say that Stephen King is nowhere near the most in-depth, fascinating horror author that you can possibly read. There are more disturbing, interesting horror authors out there who really, really hone their craft and deserve a lot of recognition for what they do. But Stephen King is populist fun. He's a good romp. He never tries to offend. He does inevitably. Invariably, he'll offend someone. He can't please everyone. I just get the impression of a very good-natured guy behind these books whenever I read them. Someone who tries, he misses sometimes he makes a home run, sometimes he swings for the bushes, but he always gives it his all. You can tell that he really is just a guy that enjoys writing, even if the writing is crap sometimes. He really does just have to churn it out. He just has to keep going. And I admire that a great deal. If there's one thing I can admire Stephen King for, if not the absolute pinnacle of his writing, the diamond quality, it's just that he's resilient and he tries his best and he gives a shit. And that's more than I can say for a lot of authors who just think that books will be their big payday to the big time. And it is in the case of Stephen King because he's cracked the formula. He knows how to make very popular books that even people who don't like to read will read. It's just like how a lot of stupid middle schoolers who don't like reading grown-up books will read Percy Jackson and the Olympians or some shit like that. And when I was that age, I couldn't for the life of me see what anyone found interesting about Percy Jackson or Hunger Games or any of those young fantasy type series. I read the shit like Edgar Allan Poe, and I think I'm a bit more disturbed for it. I'm a little more mature than I have any reason to be. I mean, I read this stuff when I was very young. I read Cask of Amontillado when I was like 5. But I will say that Stephen King does kind of the same thing for adults that young adult fantasy does for young adults, but Stephen King does it for 30, 40-year-olds who aren't willing to crack open the really grim, dark, heavy shit. So they'll crack open Stephen King, who's basically like the Coca-Cola of horror authors. I don't mean to insult him. I like a soda every now and again. It's not very substantive, at least not in this case. There are better Stephen King books that do a better job of being populist and being extremely interesting at the same time. But aside from the Langoliers, I will say that this is one of the weaker King books. And I haven't read Different Seasons yet. That's his other novella collection, mainly because it's not horror except for one. I do know the Shawshank Redemption's in there, but I've seen the movie, and the movie's so good I don't know if the book will be able to stack up to it. I'm sure it's a better case than The Shining, though. Anyway, yeah, that's my review of 4 Past Midnight, and it's currently 3:42 a.m. in the morning, so it's a ways past 4 Past Midnight. It's 3 hours and 42 minutes past midnight, so I'll call it a night here. And I would probably recommend you pick this up. I wouldn't recommend you necessarily read all 4, and if you're not in the mood to, you can absolutely skip the Library Policeman, but just pick up a copy and read the Langoliers, and if you like it, maybe go ahead to Secret Window, Secret Garden, and at that point you'll probably get tired of it. I only read the whole thing because I wanted to, and it seemed like a fun little challenge for the new year. So, until next time, happy 2025, and I'll see you in the next one. Sayonara, suckers.